Which ancient culture was way more f***ed up than most people know? Feudal China was super into burying people alive. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor responsible for the unification of China, upon his death, had 70,000 concubines, servants, and workers forcibly interred alongside him. The terracotta army was constructed only because murdering all the soldiers as well wasn't an option. The ancient Assyrians built a vast empire. The empire reached its height during the Neo-Assyrian era. From 911 BC to the fall of its largest city Nineveh in 612 BC. The Assyrian dominion, stretching from Egypt to modern-day Iraq, controlled richly diverse cultures. To quash any uprising in these conquered areas, Assyrian leaders utilized extreme violence. Their horrific campaigns were celebrated in stone reliefs festooning the palace walls. They created tablets containing every single punishment the Assyrian army carried out. They cut off the limbs, gouged out the eyes, and then left those poor victims to roam around. Those poor people serve as a living reminder of the Assyrians' cruelty. The Assyrians were proud of the mass executions. The victim's skin was hung on the city wall. The brutality of the Assyrians was extreme, even for the ancient standards of cruelty. I was recently stunned by the amount of atrocities the Japanese Empire has done. Mutilation of babies, forcing kids to rape their mothers, putting mothers into chambers with boiling grounds to test them if they would put their kids on the ground so that they don't get their feet scorched by stepping on their bodies, carrying baby corpses on bayonets. Not to mention carving a hole in the belly of pregnant women to rip fetuses cold-blooded and then murdering the fetus while the mother is screaming. There are literally no words in any dictionary to describe what they did. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt were 10 generations of absolutely fucked. Bookended by 2 actually good leaders, Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Their family history would make for a fun trashy soap opera, full of backstabbing, famicide, and a truly appalling amount of incest, as they spent 200 years running Egypt into the ground. Too bad it was all real. And yes, Cleopatra was one of history's few inbreeding success stories. She managed to get all the best traits of her insane family. And none of the bad ones. If you've got a little time. Listening to Blue at OSP lose his mind trying to describe the Ptolemaic kingdom is hilarious. I know people wouldn't be surprised by hearing about the Aztecs due to the human sacrifice from war prisoners. But oh boy, it was way worse. If I recall correctly, there was a moment of betrayal that happened from, and I'm doing this from memory. They decided to break peace by killing a princess-like figure by removing her beating heart and when inviting her father to an ominous meeting showing a boy wearing her skin and clothes. Edit. For those in the comments trying to say this is a distorted view of Mesoamerican painted by the empires that crushed them. Why can't you just accept that yes, their genocide is horrific, but they weren't angels either? It is not hard to see both things as horrible and disgusting. This very thread is proof humans everywhere can be horrible. That just makes them human. The Romans are looked up to this day for their achievements, and you still have Crassus making their soldiers collectively stab their own as punishment for losing to the slaves they would later crucify and torture. You have Japanese monks have a heartbreaking last stand with guns against their most famous conqueror. And you can still read sources about how they had a whole romance with preteen monks and prostitutes, which was seen as perfectly normal at the time. History is full of incredible people. And incredibly horrible people. Sparta. People in general remember them as just being these badass super soldiers. But don't know how Spartan society was built on draconic slavery and institutional pedophilia. One time I visited Canada in 2004 and they poured maple syrup on pineapple pizza. Sparta. Sparta has a reputation as no-nonsense badasses who dedicated their lives to become ultimate warriors. People know they were ruthless and had slaves. But the total depravity and sheer stupidity of Sparta eludes common knowledge. Sparta was an extremely oppressive state where a small elite enslaved 90+% of society and killed them for sport. But being in the elite wasn't much better. The education system was pure abuse. And produced traumatized close-minded men incapable of anything else except heaping the same brutality on the next generation. The elite Spartiate class was a closed class. You couldn't become one no matter of your services to Sparta. but it was possible to lose Spartiate status. The Spartiate class became smaller and smaller as the years went on, eventually becoming too weak to keep Sparta alive. And all this didn't even produce better soldiers. Historian Brett Devereaux has an essay series on Sparta on his blog. Highly recommended for people interested in ancient history. From the conclusion, greater than, and I want to stress this one last time, because I know there are so many people who would pardon all of Sparta's ills if it meant that it created superlative soldiers. It did not. Spartan soldiers were average. The horror of the Spartan system, the nastiness of the agoge, the oppression of the helots, the regimentation of daily life. It was all for nothing. Worse yet, it created a Spartan leadership class that seemed incapable of thinking its way around even basic problems. All of that supposedly cool stuff made Sparta weaker, not stronger. Greater than Sparta was, if you will permit the comparison, in ancient North Korea. An over-militarized, paranoid state which was able only to protect its own systems of internal brutality and which added only oppression to the sum of the human experience. Little more than an extraordinarily effective prison, metastasized to the level of a state. There is nothing of redeeming value here. Greater than Sparta is not something to be emulated. It is a cautionary tale. 10 million Africans died under the reign of King Leopold II of Belgium. Absolute horrific brutality. He belongs in the same category as Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot. Sorry. Not very ancient. But his name doesn't come up in these discussions enough. Most ancient cultures were way more cruel than people know or imagine. Just capital punishment is a great example. It's not that you did something bad and we will kill you. Oh no. It's you did something wrong and we will torture you in unspeakable ways. Death is not the goal here, it's just a byproduct. History is the worst. Genghis Khan and the Mongolians of the steppe were absolutely ruthless and efficient. Entire unknown civilizations are reportedly wiped out by them with zero trace of their culture intact. Just fields of bones saying something big was there. There was at least one incident of a drunken Mongolian post-raid demanding a group of runaways remain still while he stumbled off to find his sword and kill them. And they did out of fear for what would happen had they not. There was an instance of a relatively small recon element of Mongolians who were sent over some mountains in IIRC modern-day Russia-ish region just to see what over there. Stumbled onto an entire joint nation army. And merced them all conquering the whole damn place. The Khans were a hard people. Oddly enough though, they were relatively progressive for their time. Once your people were conquered, they didn't really care what you did, spoke, believed as long as you paid your tributes. They even protected from outside raiders. It's just, the whole getting massacred and conquered part to deal with. Source: Dan Carlin's Hardcore History Podcast Wrath of the Khans. And memory. There was one instance of their unique brutalism that came back to mind. So being the progressive conquerors they were, they pretty regularly honored the beliefs and gods of their enemies. In one such instance they'd sacked and captured a host of nobles who believed it was unholy to spill high blood. In response, the Mongolians decided to honor their traditions and rather than cut them to pieces, they laid the nobles flat, built a dance floor on top of them, and partied like hell while the nobles were crushed underneath. No blood was spilled. If one traveled to ancient Rome, some 5,000 crucified rotting corpses would guide you the way. Not necessarily ancient but the Iroquois. They had many rituals of torture for prisoners of war, including ripping out fingernails, cutting off fingers, followed by forcing them to run the gauntlet, and then if they survived they would be scalped and burned alive. The real correct answer though is that every group of human beings was by our current moral standards absolutely brutal. Nothing the Iroquois did here was unique or particularly worse than many other groups. I just haven't seen anyone mention them in this thread yet, so I figured I would. All of them were genuinely a fucked up species. A lot of Pacific cultures practiced cannibalism. Some still do in Papua New Guinea. But Maori here in New Zealand did in some tribes as well. So the worst insult you can use in the Maori language, pokakauhua, means to boil your head. Harking back to when people were boiled and eaten. The Incas. I'm Peruvian and the national myth here is that the Inca Empire was paradise on earth until the evil Spaniards showed up. The Inca Empire raped and killed its way through South America. The conquered only had two choices: be assimilated into the empire or be razed to the ground. Genghis Khan style. Samurai and feudal Japan. People like to imagine the samurai as some kind of noble order built around the belief that honor and service were to be held above all. Samurai didn't give half a sideways fuck about the common peasant. They were a blue-blood aristocracy that used their power and training to perpetuate a totalitarian regime that would make the House of Windsor blush. Some examples of the WTFNESs that people like to gloss over. Greater than showing disrespect to a samurai was cause for instant death, and disrespect could be something as simple as not bowing low and long enough. Oh, Mr. Old Rice Farm, does your back hurt from slaving in the field for your feudal lord? Well, tough shit, I don't care how loud your spine cracks when you touch your head to the ground for me. If you twitch, that a beheading. Greater than the code of battlefield honor only really counted when the losing side put up just the right amount of fight. Not enough to be a problem, but you still had to do some pointless dying to keep from all being killed anyway. Example. Oda Nobunaga committed a genocide against the Ikko-Ikki monks because they had the audacity to not insta-cave when he showed up. After several long sieges, he burned the hilltop fortress of Ishiyama. Hongan-ji Oda set fire to the mountain and blocked any escape, burning alive 20,000 men, women and children. Greater than the idea that samurai hated firearms because they saw them as dishonorable or unsporting is bullshit. They hated them because they evened the playing field. Any peasant with an arquebus could kill any samurai before he even got his sword out, and that was not okay. They couldn't have their absolute martial superiority questioned, and especially by a weapon that didn't require years of special training and, more importantly, the free time to do that training. Something your average rice farming peasant certainly didn't have. Greater than Ronin were not noble samurai seeking truth through walking the land or whatever the fuck people believe now. They were dispossessed lords who were now turning to banditry against any peasant who dared to not support them with free food and lodging. They were the equivalent of a former SEAL Team 6 member walking the road with his weapon who will kill you if you don't buy his lunch. Let him sleep in your bed. Fuck your wife and then bid him adieu with a smile and call a thank you for your service. So yeah. Samurai were aristocratic mass-murdering assholes. Edit. Just to make it a bit more clear. The Boshin War, which was waged at the start of Meiji imperial restoration that pitted the samurai class against the new imperial court and standing army, was fought 100% on the samurai side to keep their protected class. The imperial court even tried to compromise and offer them high-ranking government positions, but it wasn't enough. They still wanted to keep their place as Japanese society, and one of the stated rights they didn't want to lose was the right to carry swords in public for the purpose of protecting honor, i.e., killing a commoner on the spot if they perceived any disrespect. Also, the samurai forces suddenly didn't have an issue with guns once they started losing to ranks of peasants armed with them. Suddenly the shogun forces were all about that firearm life. Edit. Lol, apparently the 12th century isn't ancient enough for some clowns. It's not particularly ancient, and the actions aren't as fucked up as many of what is listed here. But I find absolutely insane that East India Company, a private company, ended up accidentally colonizing India. The idea that a company that exported tea would end up with a standing army is some real sigh of dystopian shit. Aztecs were pretty messed up. But Babylonia? They left behind whole walls of sculpture depicting how many hundreds of thousands they killed for sport. I'm pretty sure it was worse when Neanderthals walked amongst us, but no written record. The ancient Phoenicians, Carthaginians, had a child-killing cult. They thought that their gods needed children to be appeased. Other Canaanite, Semitic peoples dropped this practice. Depicted in the Tanakh, Bible's Old Testament, through the story of God sending a goat when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son. Although ancient Jews' annual ritualistic slaughter of thousands of animals is nothing to scoff at, murdering kids is obviously far worse. Even the Phoenicians' peers, contemporary cultures, civilizations of the period, thought it to be a barbarous practice. Here's Plato on the subject. Greater than with us. For instance, human sacrifice is not legal, but unholy, whereas the Carthaginians perform it as a thing they account holy and legal. And that too when some of them sacrifice even their own sons to Kronos. As I dare say you yourself have heard. In one notable case, during the late Sicilian Wars, Carthage itself was almost besieged and defeated. It got so bad Carthaginian civilians had to be pressed into the army instead of relying on their mercenary army. Carthage scraped by a victory at the Battle of White Tunis. But since it was so terrible, they thought the gods were punishing them. So in the aftermath of the battle, Carthaginian tried to appease the gods through, you guessed it, human sacrifice. 300 adults and 200 children were ritualistically murdered. Here is Diodorus Siculus describing the event. Greater than they also alleged that Kronos had turned against them inasmuch as in former times they had been accustomed to sacrifice to this god the noblest of their sons. But more recently, secretly buying and nurturing children, they had sent these to the sacrifice, and when an investigation was made, some of those who had been sacrificed were discovered to have been substituted by stealth. In their zeal to make amends for the omission, they selected 200 of the noblest children and sacrificed them publicly, and others who were under suspicion sacrificed themselves voluntarily. In number not less than 300, there was in the city a bronze image of Kronos, extending its hands, palms up and sloping towards the ground, so that each of the children when placed thereon rolled down and fell into a sort of gaping pit filled with fire. Ancient Greece. A lot of people imagine clean villas. People with white togas talking about arts and philosophy all day. The truth is that most people were dirt poor. Being born disabled, or being born a girl, could be a death sentence. And pedophilia was rampant among the rich. Also, a lot of their economy was based on slavery. When I was watching Castlevania, I did some research where the Dracula myth comes from and stumbled upon Vlad Tepes' Dracula, or by his nickname called Vlad the Impaler. They are not sure about the numbers, but you have to impale a lot of people to get that nickname. Funnily enough, the Persian Empire was actually way better than it was portrayed. It was extremely open to different religions and were very advanced in civil liberty. When you really look at it, the Greeks were kind of the baddies in the wars between these empires. Even Alexander basically said that after conquering Persia. But because we get a lot of our information about the classic period by Greek and Roman writers, Persia was seen as a barbaric tyrannical state. Carthaginians were apparently quite fond of burning their toddlers for shits and giggles, aka religious reasons. Kinda counterproductive, ain't it? Though it might be all Roman propaganda for all we know. We like to think before the slave trade these parts of Africa were all peaceful and great, but really they were already enslaving each other, and many larger kingdoms like the Zulu and Dahomey were oppressing the smaller one. What I always thought horrific was the imperial Chinese practice of 9 degrees. As in 9 degrees of relation. Say that someone seriously offends the emperor. The emperor then orders that not just that person, but everyone related to that person, within 9 degrees of relationship, is to be executed. Grandparents, parents, siblings, spouse, children, cousins, more cousins, concubines and their children, babies in the cradle, old people who were bedridden, all their household servants, probably their in-laws too. Later emperors were more humane, and simply executed the main offender. Then sentenced all those people to exile, a forced death march of thousands of miles, where the few survivors had to eke out a living doing hard labor. Spartan society was fueled entirely by slavery. Massive slave population. Actual citizen force pretty small and useless at anything but soldiery. According to Aristotle, the Spartans knew full well the slaves could snap and revolt at any time. And they outnumbered the masters so hugely they could possibly win. So the Spartans had a policy of keeping their slaves constantly in fear. They even had a public holiday where they massacred slaves just to break their wills. What Spain did about 500 years ago with the Inquisition, it's nuts. What's always cooked my noodle is imagining all of the horrible, awful, no good stuff that went down before recorded history. The most ancient civilization we have information on, a fake, is the Sumerians. Also, supposedly the Egyptians are dated as far back as well. 4000 BC. So 6,000 years ago. That's all we've got of recorded human history. 6,000 years. Humans have been around for way long than 6,000 years. The first modern humans, or Homo sapiens, date back 200,000 years. That's 33x as long as recorded human civilization. Imagine the type of shit that went down. It wasn't just a bunch of random monkey-looking people hanging out by themselves. They absolutely got banded up into tribes, and they went to war with each other. They could have built entire civilizations and burnt them down repeatedly. 200,000 years is a lot of years to get up to shenanigans. Ya know? And it's completely lost to time. Just poof, gone. As if it never happened. Which is honestly what will happen to all human endeavor. On the timescale of the universe, we're all just a fart in the wind. No one will remember squat about this period of human history 200,000 years from now. And what they do remember will be completely distorted from the truth. When we learned about Chinese food binding in school, I was horrified. I still am. When I think about it. Aztecs. Priests would sacrifice hundreds of people. Slaves and prisoners of war. Rip the chest open and pull their still pumping heart out. Throw the bodies down the steps. Channels were carved into the pyramid faces to let the liters and liters of blood flow down. Horrible stuff. The original people of New Guinea. The documented findings and observations of these people by the first Westerners there are simply breathtaking. And we've had one corpse float by. A newborn infant. They are always throwing away infants here. As the fathers object to observing the taboos associated with their survival. Letters from the field. 1925 to 1975. Margaret Mead. 1977. Infanticide, especially female infanticide, was quite common throughout New Guinea. The Bena Bena, for example, often killed a newborn daughter if the mother already had a small child to care for. And they also typically killed one of a pair of twins. Child Abuse and Neglect, Cross-Cultural Perspectives. Edited by Jill E. Corbin. 1982. p. 14. In New Guinea one can find infanticide. Initiation rites. Child mutilations. Sale of infants for both marriage and sacrifice. And forced homosexuality. To name only the more dramatic examples. Ibid. p. 13. When tribal mothers were asked why they killed their infants, they stated it was because they were demon children. Because children are too much trouble. Because it was a girl and must be killed. Or because her husband would go to another woman for sex if she had to nurse the infant. Children watched their mothers bury their siblings live, eat them, or toss them to sows to devour, or else they would force the grown-up children to help them kill their siblings or even sometimes make them kill live infants purchased for murdering from other tribes. Mothers who ate their children are described as overcome by frightful hunger for baby meat, again. Not because of lack of food, but because of an inner need to reincorporate infants after losing them at birth. The Origins of War and Child Abuse. Lloyd de Moss. Chapter 7. Females in New Guinea are treated brutally. Since they are routinely viewed as secretly being witches, who can kill simply by staring at a person, killer mother altars. They are often killed simply because they are imagined to have poisoned people. Mothers in New Guinea are horribly abused as girls. Being routinely raped by fathers, brothers, visitors, peers, gangs. When they become wives they are treated brutally by men and have suicide rates as high as 25%. Ibid. Where the concept of the noble savage came from. I've no idea. Anyone who's done a little bit of research in this area is shocked by what they find. Scythians, look up their skullcups. Or don't. The Hawaiians practiced a lot of infanticide. Unwanted or sickly babies would be chucked off a cliff straight into the ocean. They were also big fans of incest. Lots of sister fucking going in the Hawaiian Islands. Which actually might account for some of those deformed babies. Not sure if it counts as ancient or fucked up. But there are indications that the Merovingians had some pretty interesting burial practices. There have been excavations where they found people surrounded by multiple heads. Indications that graves were set on fire. Indications of immobilization of the dead, hand and feet bound. For example, etc. In most cases the last example can be seen as merely a ritual thing. But in some cases excavators claim people were buried alive. There's also increasing evidence that these people reopened graves sometime after burial to take, bury, exchange body parts and objects. Kind of like the saints cults that took off a bit later in the same regions. Again, it's not really fucked up emo because it doesn't harm living people. And I'm cautious about playing into the whole dark and violent Middle Ages thing. But it's definitely interesting and unexpected for most people. Especially since most high school classes depict the Merovingians as the first Christians in the region. And these practices definitely took place beyond Christianization in the area. Pedophilia was common in ancient Greece. Pederasty, a sexual relationship between a grown man and a pubescent or adolescent boy, was most common among the ancient Greeks. The older man would typically be the one who would pursue the relationship with a young boy, ideally in his teens. These relationships often involved a lot more than just sex. They were seen as a civic duty and a form of mentorship. In California during elementary school we had to learn about the California missions. Basically we were taught that the natives and the Spanish were happily existing together. But that was definitely not the case. In reality, it was straight up forced assimilation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to drop a like. If you would like to see more content like this in the future, subscribe and turn on notifications to be notified about future videos. Now check out one of these interesting videos.